Good afternoon. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Kian Navid will defend the academic thesis entitled How Many Single Rulebooks? The EU's Post-Crisis Policy Objective to Create a Single Rulebook for Investment Management. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Thank you very much. Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear supervisors, dear family, friends, and colleagues here in Maastricht and online. Today I have the privilege to present to you in an easily digestible format my dissertation, which focuses on the attainment of the EU Single Rulebook objective in the area of investment management. Now, where does this objective come from and why should it matter so much to us? Well, 1.5 decades ago, we witnessed the biggest financial crisis of our lifetimes. Financial crisis were in a free fall, first in the US, due to overly loose bank lending practices to low-income home buyers. And then the crisis spread out quickly to other parts of the world. Many banks and other financial institutions collapsed. Some avoided bankruptcy due to government interventions. But this couldn't stop the rapid downward spiral for the global economy. The steep decrease of GDP, the rapid increase in unemployment, which then necessitated yet further government interventions, which in turn increased the government debt levels of many member states far beyond the Maastricht stability criteria. And this was then followed in some member states by strict austerity programs, in turn triggering political turmoil and mass protests. So clearly our financial, economic, and political systems were faced with a severe shock, and many even argued that capitalism as a whole was failing. And to manage the crisis and discuss the way forward, world political leaders met repeatedly within a short period of time at the level of the G20 to discuss the key lessons learned from the crisis and the way forward. And one of the key lessons that emerged from these discussions was the need for regulatory consistency. So the understanding that global financial markets are interrelated, and therefore we need to address the contagion risks by ensuring that all financial actors and products are subject to a consistent level of regulation and supervision. And many of the state leaders that you see on this picture on the right, they pointed their fingers in particular to investment bankers and investment managers, such as hedge funds and private equity, as the ones responsible for the crisis. And some state leaders, like French President Nicolas Sarkozy, went even one step further, while also blaming unregulated and unsupervised investment managers for the crisis. He effectively advocated for a paradigm change in how we view the financial sector, moving away from the neoliberal belief in free markets, free enterprise, minimal state intervention, self-regulation, or laissez-faire, as he called it, towards a new era where the state would impose strict regulation on all actors and financial products. And to advise on how to reform the financial sector, the European Commission put together an expert group made up and consulted by some of the most prominent experts that Europe has to offer, such as Mario Draghi, Jean-Claude Trichet, Baron Alexander Lamfalussy, so basically the who is who of Europe. And this group was chaired by this highly decorated gentleman on the right, Jacques de la Rosière, the former managing director of the IMF. And this highly impactful report made a broad range of policy recommendations on how to reform the EU financial sector, which ultimately also resulted in the creation of a number of new EU supervisory authorities, one of I work for since over 7 years, the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, in Paris. And importantly, the report identified as one of the key lessons learned from the crisis the need for regulatory consistency, and there are over 24 references to it. And it advised legislators to radically change their policy design approach to attain this new important goal. And this gave birth to the concept of the EU Single Rulebook. And policymakers moved very quickly to embrace this new concept, and ever since repeat on a frequent basis their strong determination to create a single rulebook for the single market. So, despite the high issue salience and enormous efforts that have been made to create a single rulebook, the single rulebook remains surprisingly opaque conceptually, and we also are lacking empirical evidence to understand to what extent its core objective of achieving regulatory consistency has been attained. And 15 years into this journey, this is precisely the question that my dissertation aims to investigate. So how did I approach this question? Well, I effectively broke it down into 4 studies into an article format, investigating the following sub-questions. So, how is the novel EU Single Rulebook to be understood conceptually? To what extent is it underpinned by a coherent policy paradigm? To what extent are the rules set out therein internally consistent? And to what extent does it create a level playing field across member states? So in the first study, we first analyzed what policy design options the EU had at its disposal to create a single rulebook, the different features, their benefits, their disadvantages. And the study concludes that among the available legal tools and policy design options, EU policymakers used one of the least adequate ones from a consistency perspective, surprisingly without providing any analyses or justifications in the policy evaluation documents that are published throughout the legislative process. And while the initial proponents of the single rulebook concept around Jacques de Larosière had advised them to radically change the policy design approach or take a revolutionary step, as they called it, in the EU integration process, the legislators in the end decided to take more of an evolutionary approach, so to ensure more harmonization of national rules, but not necessarily changing the policy design approach, and not changing the approach before the crisis, which was already based on minimum harmonization directives. So as a result of this, today we have dozens of EU and national rulebooks, actually if you count the nationals, even more than 100, that are all complex and lengthy and interlinked, but not necessarily a single rulebook as indicated by the name. The second study then investigates to what extent the single rulebook has been based on a coherent policy paradigm. This is an analytical framework that has been put forward by political scientist Peter Hall over 3 decades ago, actually, to understand and analyze policy formation, stability, and change. But its emphasis on the coherence of paradigms has been challenged, especially by the so-called bricolage literature, which argues that what really happens in practice is that policymakers operate more like eclectic architects. So they combine little bits and pieces borrowed from different paradigms, but it may seem to them subjectively coherent, it may work for them politically, but it's not necessarily coherent in any objective sense of the word. And this is precisely what this case study confirms. So effectively, in the area of investment management, policymakers used a hybrid paradigm, and importantly, they did so before and after the crisis. And what also the research shows is that the attainment of paradigmatic coherence was hindered by the different national paradigms and the need to find political compromises at the EU level. In the third study, we then moved to contextualize the elevated importance of the single rulebook in light of the legal principle of consistency that is enshrined in the constitutions and judiciary systems of many member states since many years and sometimes decades, centuries. And over time, with each iteration of the EU treaties, especially since the Maastricht treaties, this legal principle gained a more and more important role in our constitution, to the extent that by now legal scholars view it as a constitutional principle of EU law that is grounded on the rule of law itself. And this, of course, underscores the importance of following a regulatory approach that is non-discriminatory or potentially arbitrary, but treats all market participants and the underlying risks posed by them alike, unless there is an objective difference that would justify a different legal treatment. To test this assumption and this goal, I applied the rules that are set out in over 24 EU directives and regulations to some key types of investment portfolios and managers. And the findings show that legislators used a form over substance approach. What this means is that they created artificial labels and contrived categories of products and managers and legal forms. But when you take one step back and look at the actual substance of what is in these portfolios and what type of managers, what type of risks are they posing, you can discern quite significant regulatory consistencies in key areas of the regulation, and sometimes even arbitrary regulatory treatment. In the fourth and final study, we go one step further, namely to investigate to what extent the EU Single Rulebook achieved its consistency objective at the national level. For this, I compared the national rules of 2 member states, Germany and Luxembourg, with respect to the implementation of the EU rules on the so-called alternative investment sectors. This is primarily covering hedge funds and private equity. And the study shows that both member states transposed the rules in a formally and legally correct manner. Luxembourg actually mirrored the approach taken by the EU legislators. It spread out the rules across 2 various national rule books, and in doing so, it made use of the wide national discretion granted to it and the various exemptions provided in the directives to ensure greater competitiveness and attractiveness of its national market. And to the extent, just to mention one example, it allows for unregulated and unsupervised investment funds. And when you look at Germany, it went exactly into the opposite direction. In terms of policy design, it chose to go for a true single rule book, meaning it actually consolidated all the rules in one single legal act. And in doing so, it addressed and essentially fixed many of the logical consistency issues that can be found in the EU regulation. It did so by gold-plating the directive, so it introduced additional rules to better protect investors and financial stability. But this, of course, came at a price, and the price is that now we have quite a wide gap between these member states. So you have Germany on the one side, Luxembourg going completely in different directions. And when you then look at it and ask the question, is this still a level playing field? Well, the answer is probably not. It is far better than what we had before the crisis, but is it really a level playing field? Well, no. Not when you look at many regulatory treatments in key areas of the regulation. So, what does all of this mean now? What are the key lessons that we can draw from this dissertation? Trying to put this into just 4 key succinct points. The first one would be the need for conceptual refinements. French philosopher Voltaire famously said, "Si vous voulez converser avec moi, définissez vos termes." So, if we want to understand one another, we shall define our concepts, otherwise we will never understand each other. And this is precisely the problem that we're still facing 15 years after the financial crisis. So we created new objectives and concepts, high policy goals, but we haven't really defined in detail what they mean. And most importantly, we haven't defined the institutional responsibilities clear enough. So who is in charge of what, and how do we aim to achieve these goals in practice? Linked to that, we need better policy evaluation tools, prescribing ex ante and ex post assessments specifically on the consistency of new and existing rules. And that's particularly important in complex policy-making systems such as the European Union, where it seems rather unlikely that we would all share the same policy paradigm. That's not going to happen very often, if ever. So you need really to improve your policy evaluation tools to assess this. If we're really serious about the single rulebook concept and the constitutional principle of regulatory consistency, this needs to be enshrined in our policy evaluation tools. And this will be then further supported by choosing a policy design that uses directly applicable EU regulations and, importantly, follows a substance over form approach, as I described earlier, so looking at the actual substance, not the legal forms. And this is quite important even beyond the area of investment management. because you can see that policymakers are increasingly venturing out to regulate new technologies and complex products such as crypto assets, decentralized finance, artificial intelligence. And again, based on the first legal acts that have been put forward so far, you can see that policymakers seem to have a tendency to take shortcuts, create new artificial labels and categories, legal forms, but that doesn't necessarily help to address the underlying risks in a consistent manner. So I believe that some of the lessons learned from this dissertation are of a broader relevance, even beyond this area of investment management to other policy areas. And I hope my dissertation gives new impetus to the debates among scholars, but also policymakers going forward. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present and your kind attention. And I'm pleased to give back the word to the pro-rector.
Thank you so much for a very clear presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor van Honacker, Professor of Administrative Governance at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Kian, let me start by congratulating you with a very relevant and very well-written thesis. I must admit, and you probably know this, that I'm not an expert in the field of investment management, but I must say you really did a great job in reflecting in a very clear and way on a rather technical topic. So very well done. In the thesis, you opt for a multidisciplinary approach, which I think is very interesting, and you build on concepts of both political science and law. And you also have the ambition to contribute to both literatures. And you say in your introduction, this is of added value, but it's also challenging. But you're very short on this, so I have actually two or three questions that are related. Could you give perhaps some concrete examples of how you sometimes struggled with the different ontologies, also different concepts? You were quoting Voltaire just before, and also the different methodologies of both disciplines. So reflect on that, make it more concrete. And then secondly, also, could you also explain how this approach has concretely impacted upon your research and also how it has enriched it? Why were you able to write a better PhD using this multidisciplinary approach? And then finally, if you would have to give advice to any other PhD embarking upon multidisciplinary research, what would be your advice? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your pertinent question and your kind words. Well, certainly embarking on a multidisciplinary research project is always very challenging. For me, there were practical challenges and, let's say, more theoretical and conceptual ones. So in terms of practical challenges, naturally, if you engage in research in two different fields, if you venture out, in my case as a lawyer, to then look into political science, theories and concepts and frameworks, that in itself poses quite a challenge in terms of, first of all, the research work. So instead of one field, you have to understand and read and process the literature of two fields, which involves basically duplication of work. So you have to master the literature of two different fields. And that adds, of course, to the workload and the complexity. To give you an example, on the legal side, the legal research turned out to be very complex and tedious, actually much more than I expected previously. And I'm a person that even works in this area since my entire career. So I was surprised by the complexity of the regulation. So, you know, I followed a comparative legal analysis approach. So I compared the rules of different member states and also different directives. And I knew that this is going to be complex, but actually researching the rules, which are spread out across different directives and regulations, structuring them in a way that makes them comparable. So this is still part of the practical challenges, of course. And then identifying are these rules that we see that are worded differently, is this just a semantic difference, or is it actually a substantive one? And to the extent that at some point my Excel sheets would crash, because just to give you an example, I mentioned this fourth study of national rules. The national rules are spread out over, I think, 300,000 paragraphs. So comparing that, just the practicalities is just insanely complex. And you could argue that in itself, by the way, is also an issue both for scholars, but also for practitioners, of course. So that certainly was a complexity. And maybe just to share one anecdote, even once you identify differences in the legal frameworks of two member states, the question then is, am I interpreting these rules right? And here I was lucky and fortunate enough to benefit from the opportunity of working for a European Securities and Markets Authority. So I'm in touch regularly with national supervisors. So on many occasions where I wasn't 100% sure, I actually reached out to colleagues asking them, do you read it the same way as I do? And here, this was also interesting. I mean, to share one anecdote, in one case, a senior supervisor said, no, I don't read it the same way as you. And I was like, are you sure? This seems quite clear in the legal text. Can you ask your head of department? He asked the head of department. The head of department said, no, I actually read it the way that Kian reads it. Okay. It went up to the head of legal, who read it differently. And essentially, in the end, we actually only solved this issue by looking into some policy evaluation documents published by the Luxembourgish government, which then clarified how to interpret the rules. And this is, of course, an immense amount of time that you spent on this. And the same thing I did, of course, on the political science area. So it's always, of course, dangerous if a lawyer like myself ventures out into the field of political science. But I was fascinated by the theories and concepts. And particularly, you saw this policy paradigm framework really captured my attention, especially because there was a lot of enthusiasm in the literature on this concept and finally being able to test this concept after the financial crisis. And doing so, operationalizing it, understanding it, operationalizing it, and then applying it, of course, is a challenge. Luckily, I was able to draw on previous work, just to mention one notable one. My highly esteemed opponent connected in Bologna. She performed, of course, a lot of work on this already over a decade ago, so it made my life, of course, much easier to look into the literature that is already out there that explains it and helps with it. But yeah, indeed, a multidisciplinary approach has various challenges, but I think I spoke enough about the challenges. It also provides a lot of benefits. So you look at an issue such as this one, Single Rulebook, objective and regulatory consistency, from two different perspectives. You look at it from a legal perspective, but you also look at it from the political science perspective, and this helps us to find better answers to the questions. And in this case, I believe it helped the research, because the combination of political science insights, in this case the policy paradigm framework and the bricolage literature, and the legal analysis, I think the synthesis, the combination of these two really helped to have a better perspective, a more deeper insight into the issue. So I would recommend it to everyone, but I would warn that it implies a little bit more work and effort. So that is something I think to be conscious of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Lucia Quaglia, Professor of Political Science at the University of Bologna, and Professor Quaglia will ask her question online.
Dear candidate, I also wish to congratulate you for your thesis. I would have two interrelated questions. The first one is, what are the most unexpected findings of your thesis? And related to this, to what extent can they be generalized to other cases or other sectors? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this very important question. So On the first one, where was I surprised? I wasn't surprised, of course, that you see differences. I think it would be unrealistic to expect in a complex policy-making system such as the European Union, where you have so many different national paradigms on how to make policy, national preferences and interests, of course, also, because I believe it's not only ideas, but also naturally interests will lead to advocating for certain types of policies. So it would have been unrealistic to expect that you see a complete level playing field and everything is completely consistent. But I was still surprised, despite having spent now over 1.5 decades in the sector. Essentially, my career started with the financial crisis, and I was still surprised as a quote-unquote expert in the field to see how much of divergence we have when you actually go into the detail. So this is something I didn't expect to see, even more so since I was hoping when you actually then dig into the policy evaluation documents that are published by the European Commission in particular, also by the Parliament to some extent, but it's mostly the Commission that does this in the impact analysis documents. And these are quite long. These are sometimes 100, 150, 200 pages long for each legal act. I was hoping to find a little bit more reflection on these issues. So you have a single rulebook objective that you declare to be a priority for you. So I was expecting to see some reflection, for example, on the policy design. So why did you choose to have a minimum harmonization directive? That seems a bit counterintuitive, no? If you want identical rules as advised by the Jacques de Larosière report, or if you want, a very, very high degree of harmonization, then you would maybe pick a policy design approach that helps you ensuring it, but there was absolutely nothing in it. Actually, interestingly, there was something on it in the most recent reviews. So there's one that is still actually ongoing. And in the policy evaluation documents, what they did is to perform surveys and interviews. And they did actually 2 rounds of interviews and surveys. And the industry said for them, there's a huge issue in terms of the consistency of the regulation. We need to improve it. This costs a lot of money. It creates complexities for them. They need to hire a lot of lawyers and compliance people. We need to improve it. But then the Commission asked them, would you then favor for us to change the policy design approach? And the answer was no. And then the Commission concluded, based on the feedback from the participants, we decided not to do it. But then the question also is that really convincing? There are other examples that I mentioned in my dissertation where they actually even explicitly say, we observe an inconsistency of our ideas. So when we look at this, it doesn't really fit with the rest of the regulation. But then they do it anyway. And then the question is, okay, what was your motivation? So here I was actually surprised to see that there is not more reflection in the policy evaluation documents. And I really read, I think, all of them. I'm probably one of the very few people in Europe that that took the time to read through thousands and thousands of policy evaluation document pages. And this is something that surprised me, that there was not more reflection on this issue. And last word on this first question, especially bearing in mind that there have been calls from national and the European Parliament to improve this. And even the European Court of Auditors has asked the European Commission to improve this. And it's not, of course, only the European Commission's task or responsibility, but so far nobody has stepped up to actually do it, to perform an in-depth analysis of the consistency of the rules. So this is something I was surprised of. I think actually even the UK Parliament did an inquiry in 2015, an analysis, and if I remember correctly, my highly esteemed opponent in Bologna was even interviewed back then on some of these issues, including on consistency. So this is not a new issue, but so far we haven't made that much progress. So since that, and also since the calls from the European Parliament, almost a decade has passed, and we still don't see these evaluations. So this is something I didn't expect, and I was surprised. And the second question, could you please elaborate a bit further what you meant with that question? I think to what extent...
whether the findings could be generalized or applied to other financial sectors as well, or is something specific to the subsectors you have looked at?
general findings, yeah, because naturally, of course, the investment management specific findings one might not be of general value, but I think, as I tried to elaborate on my last slide, there are some general lessons that can be learned from this dissertation. And this is more on the conceptual or theoretical side, so defining these concepts more specifically, the policy evaluation tools that I also just mentioned, to have more attention to regulatory consistency, especially because, and that is something that I'm not sure every practitioner is fully clear about, that regulatory consistency is not a nice to have policy objective, but it's actually a constitutional principle by now, at the latest since the Maastricht treaties, and then the Lisbon treaties further emphasize this objective. So are we really doing justice to this principle and this constitutional obligation that we have of ensuring consistency? So it should be arguably enshrined in our policy evaluation mechanisms. And then, yeah, the policy design, as I mentioned. And if you then look at, and I believe it's not only the area of investment management, the tendency of policymakers to take shortcuts. And just to give maybe one anecdote, hedge funds. What is a hedge fund? I would ask that question to anyone, and it's very difficult to define it. Even experts in the areas really, really struggle, and there's been also scholars that looked into it and they concluded it's difficult to do so. I used to work for many years as a lecturer at the University of Luxembourg, and also as part of my ESMA job, there are trainings that we give on a regular basis to NCA staff. And I every time ask that question, what is a hedge fund? And so far I haven't seen any person that has been convincingly giving me an answer, something that really is clear. Is it leverage, high leverage? Well, no, there are traditional mutual funds that might be more leveraged than hedge funds, and I put the data into the dissertation. Actually, I think according to the ECB, 44% of the hedge funds, according to their definition of what a hedge fund is, are UCITS, so retail investment funds. Is it short selling? No, not all hedge funds do short selling. What is it? And the issue to define this often then leads to an inclination of policymakers to take a shortcut, to say, okay, we can't define it, it's too complex. We just call it an alternative investment fund, and then we throw in also real estate and private equity and other things that sound a bit risky. And then we put up some rules, but that doesn't really do justice to it, no? Because arguably real estate and hedge funds and private equity are completely different things, and they pose completely different risks. If you look at the portfolios, the liquidity profiles, the risks for investors, these are completely different things. So, of course, in the policy-making process, it helps you to take these shortcuts, but it doesn't really do justice to the single rulebook objective or the constitutional principle of consistency.
Are you happy with this answer? Would you like to?
Absolutely, I'm very happy. Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by MBA Evert van Walsum, Head of the Investor Protection and Sustainable Finance Department at ESMA.
Dear candidate, dear Kian, first of all, it's a privilege to be here, and clearly I was thoroughly impressed by your work, and I thought it was excellent. But now I will turn to my question. For a financial market to work properly, it always needs to balance various things, and it's investor protection, it is market efficiency and stability. The same ingredients that you mentioned. If that is true, doesn't it by definition mean that it has to reconcile different opposing paradigms, such as market making and market shaping? In other words, doesn't that per se exclude the existence of a clean, non-bricolage policy paradigm? Wouldn't that also exclude the possibility of a directional bricolage to move too much into one direction? For example, a fully market-shaping paradigm would likely render the market to be non-functional, as it would disregard market players' interests. by, for example, only focusing on investor protection. What's your views on that?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for raising this challenging question, and of course your very kind words. So indeed the question of the application of paradigms and practice is quite an interesting one, because at the EU level you see this evolution of how it, the priorities shifted since the financial crisis. But you don't see the same thing at the national level necessarily. So I think this case study that I performed in Luxembourg and Germany is a very good example. Because here you see, especially in Luxembourg, that despite the financial crisis, and even more so, despite a government change, a quite radical one, under Juncker, they had a conservative government that was very pro-market. And then they shifted to Xavier Büttel, as you know, I think over a decade ago by now. And the financial market was actually in panic when this happened in Luxembourg, because Xavier Büttel is from the Liberal Party, but he had to enter into a coalition with the Greens and the Socialists. And as we know, these are not necessarily always advocates of the market-making paradigm, rather the opposite. And despite this shift, you still see very strong adherence to this paradigm of market making. So it's still very sticky. And I put one of these quotes into my dissertation where he gave a speech in front of hundreds of investment managers saying that it would be very easy to bash the financial sector, but to me you did great. We're proud of you because you actually added to the wealth of this country. So from their perspective in Luxembourg, this the finance sector, it may have some issues. It may require some regulation, and this is something I think a learning process that also advocates of the market-making paradigm have gone through. But on the whole, the adherence to this market-making paradigms still seems very much stickier than you would maybe expect to happen. So why do I say this? Well, naturally, I think if you're not married to either paradigm, and probably you, my highly esteemed opponent, and myself, we might be a bit more in the middle, but I think if you are not married to either camp, you probably will see the need to have some regulation, but also not go overboard, because market efficiency and competitiveness is still important. But you do see that that national paradigms still vary. And it's not only Luxembourg and Germany. I think probably if you looked at Ireland and Malta and Cyprus, they would very much also have a similar perspective as Luxembourg. If you looked at maybe France, Italy, Spain, they would have a very different experience, because also there you saw the damages that the financial markets can do to an economy. And here, I agree with you that by definition, if you seek for a balanced approach, you would have to combine both. So try to foster efficiency and market competitiveness, but also try to seek for investor protection. I think this is what EU legislators did. So my study in no way means to undermine what has been done. I think it has been great progress, and Europe really tried to find a compromise. And you know better than I that this is very difficult to achieve at the European level. But in doing so, you had to compromise some of the, let's say, intellectual coherence. And this is then very much demonstrated when you look at the case studies, whether it's the case study at the European level or the national level, where compromises had to be made between these advocates of the different paradigms. And this led to a situation where the coherence of ideas, so the ideas, the assumptions, the priorities, they didn't agree, and they made a compromise. And by the way, I believe that theoretically speaking, a compromise doesn't always need to result in incoherence or inconsistencies. In theory, you could imagine compromises that preserve consistencies in the sense that you would make a compromise and say, well, I want to ensure protection of investors in this very key area. You want to foster, market efficiency in that area that is very dear to you. So you get that, and I get this. Unfortunately, quid pro quo, you get that, and I get this. But what happens in practice often at the European level, and I think both you, my esteemed opponent, and myself, I think we can speak from experience, is the so-called constructive ambiguity. And that is a term that is very often used by EU bureaucrats. So this is something where then you use a wording that somehow makes both parties happy and leaves some room for different interpretations, and then both take it as a win, and they go back and declare a victory. But it doesn't really help the issue, because in the end, maybe 5 or 10 years later, once they've all implemented the rules and start applying it, well, they still apply it according to their reading of this provision. Did you really help convergence with this? And I think this is where, potentially also our approach to how we make compromises might need to change. I think it's unrealistic to expect that we would all agree on one paradigm. Our perspectives are too different, and by the way, also our political and economic interests are too different. But we need to find a balance between these different interests, and we need to do this in a more structured manner with better policy evaluation tools and better policy design options.
Very clear. Thank you, Kian.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Toon van Overbeke, Assistant Professor in Europe, Climate and Digital Society, also at FASOS.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, this thesis has already received a lot of praise, and rightfully so. I think it's a really nice piece that shows some real intellectual clarity and rigor, and I think that's to be commended. And I think in a week where people like Bruno Le Maire and Christian Lindner are calling to deepen European capital markets, maybe we need to send them a copy of this, because there might be some interesting conclusions for them, right, to put them in the right direction. Now, having said that, of course, we have some questions. And I would particularly want to talk about your last empirical chapter, where you compare Germany and Luxembourg in a very nice way, trying to answer this question. Did you actually manage to close the door, or is there actually still room for arbitrage in this alternative investment sector, whatever that might mean? And you say, based on the figures you quote, I can then sort of deduce that sort of 60% of that market is located in Germany and Luxembourg. Now, of course, as a political scientist, I'm interested in external validity. What about the other 40%? Can you, maybe based on work you did in this thesis, or maybe based on your professional experience, give us an insight? Do we see even more inconsistencies outside of these countries, or do maybe some countries align with Luxembourg or Germany? Can you give us an insight on this? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and this very important question. Because indeed, when I think over 6 years ago, I decided effectively on the methodology and also the case selection, I thought long and hard about, okay, which cases do I pick? Ideally, I would have liked to pick all of the member states, 30 or a very big sample, 20 or 10. But I mentioned earlier in my speech that this, because of the length and the complexity of these rule books, just wouldn't have been feasible. Already after 6 years, I think some in my family are very annoyed with me for having spent so much time on this. But jokes aside, indeed, this is something that you need to be selective on. So which countries do you pick? I picked Luxembourg and Germany because of the issue salience. So you have 2 member states that are in the top 3 or 4. Germany the largest in terms of alternative assets, Luxembourg number 3, but then Luxembourg number 1 altogether because it also has a lot of mutual funds or UCITS, so retail funds. So you want a topic that has a high issue salience for both member states. Why? Because if you picked one country that doesn't have a very high issue salience, would you really detect different paradigms and different national implementation approaches? And the reason why I think you see so many differences between these two is that they are pretty much, I would say, on the outer spectrum. So if you look at the market making and the market shaping paradigm, or you could also call it neoliberal and interventionist, so they're probably more towards the extremes. maybe on the interventionist side, the French and Italians might, in some cases, have gone further than the Germans. But what I really liked about the German approach to also investigate it is that they chose a different policy design options. So I knew from experience, having worked in the sector, that they actually went for a true single rulebook. And I mentioned that in this dissertation, that is actually a good thing, because it challenges you as a policymaker to see all these rules in one legal act. And it may sound a bit silly, but if you put that all into one single legal act, even just visually, you start to realize, hold on, Article 10 says this and Article 15 says something else. Is that really consistent still? And that is something that many other member states didn't do. They mirrored the EU approach. They spread it out across different legislations. And here I therefore expected to see bigger expected to see bigger differences than I did. Now, coming to your question, I think if you picked proponents from the different paradigms, so if I had compared Ireland to France or Malta to Italy, I think the differences will be very similar. If I had picked Ireland and Luxembourg, the difference probably wouldn't be that different, because they're both advocates of the market-making paradigm. They both see the financial market as a net plus and rather something positive than risky or negative. So here you would have probably seen less differences. And actually, I think last year, or was it 2 years ago, there was one case study that was published on the depository rules under the AFMD. So this is a very specific niche provision. But the scholar compared the depository rules in France and Luxembourg. And the differences were very similar to what I observed. So France had gold-plated the provisions, and Luxembourg had gone to the extent possible and allowed under the EU rules for the most business-friendly, competitiveness and efficiency-friendly interpretation and implementation approach. So I think, yes, if you picked two advocates of the same paradigm, probably the differences will be smaller. If you pick two from different ones, there will be similar findings.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Elisaveta Radulova, Associate Professor in Educational Development at FASOS Maastricht University.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I would like to join my colleagues in complimenting you about the clarity and the conceptual curiosity your PhD engages with. I really, in particular, found insightful this sort of continuum you built with regard to how paradigm shifts occur with the stages of non-directional and directional bricolage. So my question is very much related to this. Where are we in this transition, if we assume that there is a transition, where we are in this transition between kind of commensurable, non-directional, constructive ambiguity. Lots of terms were thrown, but basically meaning some form of modeling through, and a true attempt to move towards some form of paradigmatic purity, or at least more and more in the direction of what you also show on page 67 of House model. So I was curious on that. But so that would be my first question. And then while listening to you, while reading the thesis first of all, and listening now to you, I continue being stumbled on a kind of inconsistency, and this is about consistency. So I really would like you to declare yourself on this. You state very clearly in Proposition 1, regulatory consistency is predicated on a paradigm shift, and yet the entire work today, and also your own examples now, and even this self-identity declaration, I believe in approaches from both paradigms, show that this is an unattainable ideal. So are you basically stating that this constitutional principle of regulatory consistency, legal certainty, these are unattainable ideals? And if we are on that road, where are we if we assume that there is a continuum? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this excellent question and also your kind words. So essentially there are two elements. The first one is quo vadis, so where are we heading? And if you had asked me this a year or two ago, when I think most of these chapters were already written, I would have answered you, yeah, we can discern a very strong movement towards the market-making paradigm. And I mean, that has been witnessed in all these legal acts that have been published ever since. And likely because of Brexit, so because of the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union, basically the strongest advocate of the market-making paradigm, this move will even be further fostered. So because the United Kingdom is no longer part of the political negotiations, you will see more and more the embrace of the market-shaping paradigm, and you will see more and more consistency with it with each new legal act. To some extent, that I think holds true still today. There is clearly a majority of member states, large member states, that rather lean towards market shaping than market making. And that's natural, I think, also given the lessons learned from the financial crisis. So we know what happens if we leave financial markets unregulated. We're probably not going to go back to that. And this trend will potentially continue. But the reason why I'm nuancing this answer and why I tell you maybe today I have the feeling that this might shift is that now we're suddenly faced with a new shock. So you had COVID, and now you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as a consequence of that, you have very high inflation and you had a fear of a recession and potentially a new economic crisis. So far, it has worked out relatively smoothly, I must say, given the circumstances. And I know, of course, there have been various issues in some member states. I don't want to downplay it, but you would have maybe expected that the outcomes would be even worse if you shut down your economies for a year or 1.5 years and then reopen, and then there is a war in Europe. You would have expected maybe even worse outcomes. But luckily, also thanks to very strong interventions from governments and central banks, that was avoided. But we're still not, I would say, fully through the cycle. To be seen what happens in the next few years. So why is this relevant? Well, if in a year or 2 or 3 from now, we're facing very adverse economic situations, I wouldn't be surprised if the paradigm, let's say the paradigmatic expansion of moving more and more towards market shaping might then move back, where maybe then some member states are like, hold on, we need to be a little bit more business friendly. We need to ensure more efficiency of markets. We need more investments. We need investments in particular, by the way, also into green transition. So if we add a lot of bureaucratic red tape, if we add very high investor protection provisions and rules, okay, maybe some investors are protected, but this is hampering economic development, and maybe we should take a few steps back. And that is something that you cannot rule out would happen. So I think this is a learning process, and personally, I don't see adherence to these paradigms as binary, but more of a spectrum. So I think there are very few people that are fully subscribed to the new liberal or the market making or the market shaping paradigm. Most people are somewhere in between there, and it's a learning process, and we learn as we go. So I wouldn't rule out, to answer your first question, that maybe if the economic crisis becomes worse, and hopefully it doesn't, that we might take a few steps back. So I think it also depends a bit on the externalities, to call it that way. And then on your second question, is regulatory consistency as a constitutional principle maybe unattainable? That is a very good question, because I think it depends on your standards and expectations. If you expect full consistency of all the rules, especially if you have these complex rule books. I mentioned one example, I think MiFID, which I think you, my esteemed opponent, you've made various publications on this topic. I think some experts have gone through it and counted actually the number of paragraphs, and they reached 1.5 million paragraphs. So it's extremely lengthy, complex. I don't know how many human lifetimes you would need to actually read and process it. So is it really realistic that even in this one single act you will achieve consistency, intellectual, and then potentially with all the other legal acts? Yeah, that seems like a very, very high goal. That might not be achievable in complex policy areas such as financial regulation. But could you improve on the consistency? Could you reach a much higher level than today? I think that yes. If you changed the policy design approach as advocated by this expert group around Jacques de Larosière to opt for regulations more, if you had better policy design tools, if you had better policy evaluation mechanisms, so if there was actually the legal obligation to look at, are these rules some form of consistent, and at least a discussion on it, an identification of the problem and discussion, and maybe in some instances you have a good justification to not go for full consistency, but at least identifying it. If that would be done, I think you could, have a much better framework, unfortunately, from a consistency perspective, of course. But then, and that is the last word, of course, consistency is a noble goal, but you want consistency at a high level. So you don't want consistency at a low level. And this is, I think, also something really interesting, because probably both the advocates of the market making and the market shaping paradigm would agree that consistency is good. Because the market making ones, they want consistency because it hampers business. So it is not efficient. Markets do not operate efficiently if you don't have consistent rules. It actually adds to complexity. It hampers cross-border business. The industry is complaining about it all the time. So market making advocates don't want inconsistency, and market shaping advocates want neither. They want consistently high levels. They want to have very secure financial markets. So it's really about how do we. There's a consensus that we want consistency, but is it consistently high in terms of investor protection and financial stability, or is it consistently voting for more efficiency and more competitiveness? And that is something that is very difficult to achieve. And as I mentioned, I believe also the way we think about making political compromises might need to shift a bit. Because yes, we can make compromises, but still preserve consistency. Maybe not in all cases, but you don't have to go for this constructive ambiguity. And this is something that I think maybe is also a learning curve. So it may take some time to learn from this, because you see more and more attention also to the issue of consistency. And hopefully over time we can improve our tools and the evaluation mechanisms to reach that goal. So in short, full consistency when you have millions of paragraphs and hundreds of rule books, no. But can we reach a much higher level? Yes.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes left, so I will still give the opportunity to Professor Quaglia online, if she's still there, yes, to ask her question, but you might not be able to answer, we'll see.
So dear candidate, let me start by saying you produced a very solid piece of research. I very much enjoyed reading your thesis. My question is the following. What do you think are the main limitations of your thesis? There's a bit of self-reflection.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this excellent question. So indeed, this is one of the questions that I asked myself at the beginning of this journey over 6 years ago, and I discussed it in detail with my highly learned supervisors. So indeed, I think the biggest challenge is when you have a comparative legal analysis.
It's over. So, Kian Navid, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. So, Kian Navid, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee here present has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Versluys is authorized to confer upon you this great academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority invested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Kian Navid, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
We have a picture with the three of us, right? I think maybe we need to stand here so that you really see it.
Dear Dr. Kian. You say it out loud once. Dr. Kian. You made it.
Thank you.
Annette and I are so extremely proud of you, and you deservedly really can call yourself Dr. Kian Navid from now onwards. Almost 6 years ago, I looked it up on 18 September 2017. I received an email from Annette saying that she had this Skype meeting with this guy from ESMA. She probably said it more nicely, you know, Annette, wanting to do a PhD. She asked me to be on board, saying, well, he really made a very good impression. He looks very organized, he knows the policy and the legislation really well. I think he can really write a nice PhD on this. Well, I think after today, and everybody here agrees, Annette has very good people skills. She can really tell, based on only one Skype meeting. Really, Kian, in all my years of supervising PhDs, I have never ever seen anyone so organized and so easy to supervise. In these 6 years, we've seen you take a deep dive in academic research with a passion, perseverance, and purpose that are truly impressive for any PhD candidate, and certainly for anyone juggling a demanding career and a family life next to doing a PhD. And what is most amazing is how you managed to just very steadily keep on going. So many things happened in these 6 years, with all the potential elements of making it difficult to complete the job. Promotions and increasingly busier work life, moving apartments, taking care of ill family members. And there was also something else. What was it again? Something called COVID? Despite all these efforts from the universe to work against you, you persevered and you kept on working on your research. And additionally amazing was how you managed to very quickly learn the language of the political scientist. Trained as a lawyer, you referred to that today, and working in such a bureaucratic environment as an EU agency, it does not always neatly go hand in hand with how political scientists actually think about the world. And you managed to really get yourself acquainted with this new discipline very fast and without any major effort from our side. So, for those of you who wonder, how does a lawyer working in an incredibly busy EU agency during COVID and all sorts of other hectic life events manage to finalize a political science-oriented PhD? I guess we simply need to ask Kian if we have the opportunity during the reception later. But let me, in the audience, let me reassure you that Annette and myself, we had nothing to do with this.
That's not true.
Whenever Kian emailed us saying that he was ready for a meeting, we could be sure that this was perfect reading material. Let us share with you one example that captures this very well. Usually, sending in a draft for comments and review means that you would expect a half-finished document at best, with annotations about the envisioned content of sections still to be completed, and numerous missing references. Still, the full draft is then ready, 5 to 10 more iterations and considerable revisions down the line. This is not how things work with Kian. You can imagine our surprise that Kian, by contrast, he told us that he would soon be sending us a draft of the dissertation manuscript to review and discuss, and we actually received a complete manuscript, edited and proofread, with a fully developed and coherent argument, appropriate empirical evidence, and a full reference list in alphabetical order, even in the correct citation format. That is the power of Kian. Next to missing the extreme ease of this PhD trajectory, well, at least that's how Annette and I perceived it, perhaps you perceived it slightly differently, what we will really miss is our really insightful and inspiring conversations. I also really wanted this defense to last longer. I was enjoying it so much listening to you. Every meeting that we had would mean more insight into this fascinating world of how the EU works or doesn't work in practice. So we would really like to thank you, Kian, for enriching our own thinking about EU policy in action. And most of all in the research that we also did together with Niklas, who you also very kindly supervised on the role of trust in EU financial cooperation. Annette and I were just saying, we need to find a new opportunity to keep on cooperating with you somehow. In short, while you might be very happy and relieved that this day now marks an end to your PhD trajectory, and maybe somebody in the audience as well, Annette and I are actually a little sad today that we will now have to miss our lovely conversations. Again, Kian, many congratulations on these wonderful achievements. And as a conclusion, perhaps could we add one more proposition on our side to the excellent list that you already prepared? Crafting the European Single Rulebook in the financial sector and in other policy areas requires deep policy insight and knowledge, but also, in equal measure, curiosity, open-mindedness, a sense of humor, and ability to forge compromise among different worldviews. Kian, you bring all these qualities together in a very unique way, and it has really been a true pleasure to get to know you and to work together. Congratulations.
Congratulations. So well.
So much beaming, so much smiling, but I have to formally close the ceremony, and then we can celebrate on. Dear Dr. Navid, sounds good, eh? Dear Dr. Navid, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would very much like to congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. I now close this ceremony. Before I do so, I just want to say, the audience, we will have the drinks in the refter. We'll take a picture with the young doctor, also with Professor Quaglia, and then on the stairs, and then we will celebrate, and I hope you enjoy your day and your achievement.
Thank you very much.